Bruce Stokes is going to be talking about the new global economy and America's role. Oh, sorry. And you all have his bio, so I'll be brief, but he's the director of the Pew Research Center. Research Center's global economic attitudes. He's also at the German Marshall Fund as a senior transatlantic fellow for economics, or was in September 2010, and he's a former international economics columnist for the National Journal and is now the contributing editor. So I will hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here, and since I assume you guys are tough graders, I hope I live up to the whatever the standard is. Since we're a small group, I suggest that as we talk, if you have a question or a comment, just interrupt me. We shouldn't have this as a lecture and then you kind of respond. I mean, that works when you have 100 people. When we're this small of a group, I think we should make this more of a discussion. Especially because I'm going to throw up some numbers from various surveys we've done, and often they deserve explication. And if I'm not explaining it adequately, or you have a question, we should stop it and talk about that number rather than wait to the end. And since I'm supposed to be a professional communicator, if I'm not communicating properly, if I begin to lapse, as many people in Washington do, into acronyms that only longtime residents of Washington would even understand, don't hesitate to interrupt me, and we can discuss that. And certainly, hopefully, I will say something that will be so outrageous that you have to jump in and object or at least question. Again, as an old friend of mine used to say, if you can't be comprehensive, at least be provocative. And so I hope to accomplish that goal as well. The U.S. and the world economy is obviously a very broad subject, and there's a lot of different avenues we could take. I think that we have to kind of recognize that this economy has both been deeply integrated into the world economy and somewhat separate from the world economy, depending how you measure it, since its beginning. I mean, obviously, we were a colony. Part of the Revolutionary War was fought over the fact that Britain wanted to limit our self-reliance, our independence from the world economy, which meant independence from the British economy. And one of the causes of the war, of the Revolution, was our resistance to being forced to trade with Britain when we wanted to do more and more of the production ourselves. That tension has existed, it seems to me, throughout our history. One of the causes of the Civil War, one of the causes that I think is not fully appreciated, is the difference between the North and the South about whether we would be an economy that produced much of what we consumed, or whether we would be an economy that traded to get what we needed based on what we could produce. When the fights that developed in the 1840s and 1850s were playing themselves out, one of the biggest fights in Congress, in fact, if you look at the chronicles of the Congress, an inordinate amount of time was over tariffs, or fights over tariffs, and it generally broke between Northerners and Southerners. Northerners wanted very high tariffs to protect themselves from foreign imports so they could build up the industry in the North. And Southerners, who produced agricultural products, didn't produce that kind of stuff, wanted to be able to buy machinery from London or wherever as cheaply as possible, trading their cotton or their tobacco or whatever in return. And so they wanted very low tariffs. And that tension was one of the contributing factors in the Civil War. I mean, if you go back and you look at Jefferson Davis's inaugural address in Montgomery, Alabama in 1861, when he inaugurated the Confederacy, most of that address is about tariffs. It's not about slavery. From him, maybe for understandable reasons, he didn't see that as an issue. Of course we're going to have slavery. But what he was really worried about was we were going to create a confederacy that was a low-tariff confederacy, which meant it was going to be more plugged into the global economy than those Northerners wanted to have. And so from at least his perspective, a very parochial perspective, I would say, but from his perspective, one of the issues, contributing issue to the Civil War, was exactly how much we should be integrated into the world economy. But the connection of this economy to the world, or at least this domestic economy and this government to the world, really goes back to the writing of the Constitution. When we wrote the Constitution, one of the issues of tension between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution was who would control international trade, who would control international commerce. Because under the Articles of Confederation, every state controlled their own commerce with the rest of the world. And the Constitution gave that power to the newly created federal government. And it did it in kind of a backdoor way. I mean, it wasn't really thought through. I mean, what the Constitution says is that Congress shall have all control over international commerce. In retrospect, 200 years later, this was a really bizarre way to do this. Because almost every other country in the world, at least certainly every country that I know of, the control of international commerce is in the executive branch. In our Constitution, the control of international commerce is constitutionally in the hands of the legislative branch. Why is that? It's because something like 80% of all revenue of the new country we were creating in 1789 was going to come from tariffs. And remember that we fought a Revolutionary War in part over who would control revenue and taxation. And the writers of the Constitution, who were veterans of the Revolutionary War, basically said, we're not about to give the king, the new king, the president we're creating, the power to control taxation and revenue the way the old king back in England did, and we fought to resist that. We're going to put it in the hands of the directly elected representatives of the people. And so the power of taxation and spending is in the hands of the Congress. And almost as an afterthought, that meant that Congress had control of international commerce because that's where the source of the revenue was, right? I mean, there was no income tax, there was no estate tax, there was none of that. There was no sales tax. There were tariffs. So what we have now is a system where international commerce is in the hands of Congress. And again, as I said, that led to interminable debates over the years in Congress about tariffs. And so much of the fight over policy around trade and international commerce has been in the Congress and has been between the Congress and the executive branch, with the executive branch resisting and saying, look, international commerce is increasingly an element of foreign policy. It's about the relationship with the rest of the world, and we think the executive branch should have that power, but Congress is not willing to give up its constitutionally mandated power. And what we now have is, in essence, an 18th century solution to a problem, and we're trying to apply it in the 21st century. That's one of the shortcomings of how we deal with our connections to the world, is that we have a constitution that doesn't allow us to do what is probably the most efficient and effective means. Now, you can flip that, and I think that we should flip that. Trade was, for many years and many generations, really, the exclusive preserve and interest of a very elite segment of the society and of the business community, for that part. We were, and still are, obviously, a continental economy. So a relatively small portion of our economy is traded. It's growing rapidly, but relative to, say, countries in Europe, we're still pikers, right? I mean, we still not that integrated into the global economy, in part because they're smaller, and they're closer together, and they don't have all the resources inside their own countries. We have a lot of that for ourselves already. So our economy is not as integrated, and as a result, that meant that for many, many years, international commerce, or what came to be called globalization, really didn't affect most people. I can say when I was growing up in the 1950s, in a small town in western Pennsylvania, nobody traded. The idea that you would be able, that the Japanese or the Europeans would have the money to buy what we would sell them, that they would even want what we would sell them, was inconceivable, right? Now, of course, the steel mill in my hometown, which still exists, remarkably, 15% of what it produces is exported to Japan. So that's a totally different economy in just one lifetime. But up until, I would say, our generation, the fact that the Congress wanted to keep control of commerce and the executive branch wanted it back even more in the hands of the elite, was an inside Washington fight. What's interesting now is that globalization touches all of our lives. Globalization affects us all in a variety of ways, culturally, economically. We travel more, we communicate more. All of us use products that are foreign made that our parents or grandparents would have never thought to buy from abroad. Now we probably can only buy it abroad. And because globalization affects us all in our lives in ways, and certainly your students even more so as they grow older, there is actually some value in having the Congress more deeply involved in control of this. Because if something affects the lives of every American every day, shouldn't the directly elected representatives of the American people have more of a say in what that policy is? At least there's a theory there to overcome our problem with an 18th century constitution that has created all sorts of problems. That said and done, that's about how policy is made. And we can talk in greater detail if you want to in Washington. I'm happy to explain how we make trade policy and globalization policy here in D.C. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how we perceive the world and how the world perceives us as we become more of a globalized economy. And the data I'm going to throw up here is data that is derived from a variety of surveys done both in the United States and abroad by a group called the Pew Research Center. The Pew Research Center is a think tank in Washington. We do public opinion surveys up the wazoo. I mean, we're in the field all the time, especially domestically, and we are in the field every 6 months or so internationally. Some of this data will come from our most recent Global Attitude Survey, which we've been doing this is the 11th year. The Global Attitude Survey was the first survey you may have heard of that identified all this anti-Americanism around the world back in 2002, 2003. And some of this survey is from the data I'll show you is from our domestic surveys. But I'm happy to go into the methodology of these surveys, but basically they involve about 1,000 people in every country. Standard methodological approach. If they're 51% of the population is women, then 51% of the people that you survey are women. If 25% are people under 30, then 25% of your surveys. I mean, it's a standard methodology, usually telephone or face-to-face interviews. And the margin of error is anywhere from 3.5% to 4.5%. So it just to give you a flavor of some of these results. Get out of the way here. One of the issues facing us today is going to probably shape our economy in the near term more than any other single thing is something that's happening in the international economy, not the domestic economy. Our domestic economy, as bad as things are, 18.2% unemployment, that's pretty bad. And it's, unemployment that you know better than I do in your communities is even often higher than that, and certainly the number of people unemployed has been, people have been unemployed longer, more people have been unemployed longer than at any time since the Depression. That said and done, probably the most important single threat to the economic stability of the United States and the global economy today is the euro crisis. And we can get into how and why that happened. But from an American perspective, what we know is that if Europe gets this wrong, if they somehow screw this up, and they seem to be coming closer and closer to the edge of doing that, the reverberations in the United States will be profound. Europe is our largest single export market. It is the site of more U.S. direct foreign investment than any other region of the world. 57% of the revenue earned by American companies abroad comes from Europe. So as you can imagine, if Europe goes into recession or even depression, that has real ramifications for the U.S. economy. Probably a more immediate and almost overnight implication would be, we know from 2008, when Lehman Brothers fell and AIG, the American International Insurance Group, fell, capital markets froze up. And what that means is that we all live in economies that are based on lending. I sell you something, you say I'll pay you in 30 days, and I borrow some money to cover that time when I'm not going to get paid. Or, I sell you something, but you're not going to get it for 30 days, so I have to ship it to you, and somebody's got to insure that when it's shipped, and so you borrow money to do that. What we found in 2008 was that lenders couldn't trust the reciprocal person on the other end of that transaction. And rather than lend you money or say, okay, you're going to pay me back in 30 days, I trust that, people said, I'm just not going to do anything. I'm not going to sell you things. I'm not going to lend you things. And if you look, for example, at German exports in that period, Germany is one of the most export-dependent nations in the world. Literally, the chart goes like this. German exports just stopped because nobody would insure them, nobody would finance them, etc. And so we have to be very worried in a euro crisis that would happen for some period of time. Could be a couple days, could be a couple weeks, God forbid it were a couple months, but that would probably throw the whole world into a recession. So that's why we have to worry about the euro crisis. One of the issues here is the American people aren't yet probably fully paying attention to this. If you took a survey, I can swear to you, if you took a survey across the street at the Treasury Department and the White House, and you said, will the euro crisis affect the U.S. economy, 100% of the people would say yes. It's widely believed inside the Obama administration he won't get reelected if this thing goes south. But only 41% of the American people say it's a major threat to the U.S. economy. So there is a gap here between how we perceive it and how people who are more involved in it perceive it. And what's interesting is it is older people who are more likely to perceive it as a threat than younger people. That makes sense. Younger people are probably more interested in following these issues. But it is in part your responsibility to make sure that number goes up. And as you can see, college-educated people are more likely to believe that this is a problem than people who lack a college education. Again, not surprising, but again, it probably underscores the importance of this. Yes, I'm sorry, yeah.
Is the employment rate taken into account?
In terms of unemployed, educated, college-educated, or just
people that are unemployed, do they view the economic force?
That's a very good question. As far as I know, we don't do a demographic on that. But I go back, this is why I love to do these presentations, because that's a question I never thought of. When you do these surveys, you ask a bunch of demographic questions at the end. Are you male or female? What age group are you in? What's your become kind of very broad categories, etc. And where do you put yourself in kind of the political spectrum, to the left, the center, the right? But I don't know if we ask people whether they're employed or unemployed. That would be a very interesting metric to have, to try to analyze some of this. I know we do it on purely domestic surveys, where we're trying to figure out how people feel about unemployment. Obviously, people who are unemployed probably are more worried about that than people who. But that's a very good question. I will ask. But what we find,
So when you would accept that to be more correct too, because the older people control 70% of all the money, they have a stronger interest in what's happening.
They absolutely do. I mean, one, they have more experience in the world. They have more to lose. You're right. For a variety of reasons, older people are going to. But the reality is, you still only have 41% of the population saying that this is a major threat to the U.S. economy. And I think in a democracy in particular, what you don't want is surprises. You don't want there to be a recession tomorrow and people say, whoa, where'd that come from? You know, and then they get a lot of finger pointing, you get a lot of kind of fear mongering, and what you need is obviously people to understand this is a potential threat. We need to, because, and I'll get into this, but one of the issues is, if this starts to unravel, what do we do about it? Is there anything we can do about it? Is it in our self-interest to do anything about it? And I think that's one of the issues we have to confront. Yeah, but you're right.
I was just going to say, don't you think it's also related to the fact that news reading and paying attention to news at all is become so age-related?
Oh, yeah.
Not that from another.
No, I agree. Well, look, but the first issue is this is in the third week of May, because we do a survey we do an analysis of what is in the news. In other words, what's in the print media and what's on the electronic media, including radio and TV, cable, etc. And that's called the news hole. In other words, we've got 100%. In that period, it was 100% of the coverage. How much of it was devoted to the European economy? Only 5%. So, in the first instance, the news media, one might argue, is not doing their job, right? They're not telling people, look, you should worry about this. You're right that if they did more of that, still, it's probably older people who would be paying more attention to the younger people because of the. Yeah, right. Now, it is true though that if we ask people who say they have been paying attention to the news, this is another survey we do periodically, and you say, what are you following? What are you paying attention to? And those who say they're following the news closely, 37% said they were following the Greece situation closely, and 44% said they were more broadly following the European. So that's not bad, and it more or less tracks with 41% who say that they're worried about they see it as a major threat. So there is some coherence there. Another issue that we have is China. And those of you who follow these issues, and I'm sure you all do, know that this has been a potential issue for the United States for a number of years. In the 1980s, I look around, and some of you are old Zion, we remember the challenge posed by the Japanese. The fact that we've gone through that is probably both good and bad. It's good in the sense that the China challenge is not new to a generation of Americans. It's the second time we've been facing this kind of major challenge. The bad news probably is we say, oh, we overestimated the Japan challenge, we're now overestimating the China challenge. I would argue with you very strongly that these are separate challenges. And the fact that Japan eventually blew up, in essence, its economy blew up, and it's really not a major challenge to the United States today, doesn't mean that China will do the same thing. I mean, we have to assume that it's a major challenge, and we have to address that challenge in its own right. We also have, as you know, a long history in the United States of prejudice against foreigners, and especially against some Asians. We've had legislation in our history discriminating against Japanese and discriminating against Chinese. It is a little interesting. We we tend to wax and wane about China. If you look at our history, there are times when we love the Chinese. They were our favorite Asians. And we were going to, they were going to help them build a democracy. We were going to Christianize them. We were going to do all these wonderful things. And there's also been this fascination, and there's a huge market, and if we just sell them a pair of shoes, everybody in China, a pair of shoes will make millions. So there's been that, and there's obviously been the opposite, which is this incredible fear of the yellow peril, this incredible fear of the red menace, and all of those kind of prejudices that we had, the fears that we had, some of them not illegitimate, certainly in the Cold War, but so we've kind of gone back and forth. And as you can see, at least in our data going back now 7 years, basically we have gone from a somewhat favorable view of China, somewhat unfavorable, back a little more favorable, and now it seems to be going back towards unfavorable again. So the public is, I would say at this moment, very divided about China. Yeah.
That looks like an election. I mean, there's a convergence of the 2 election years.
Yeah. And there may be some. That's a very good point. I mean, it basically what we may be picking up here is in the tail end of the Bush years, basically a lack of confidence in the administration rather than anti-Chinese sentiment. And what you may be picking up here is basically a confidence in the Obama administration's ability to handle this, and then maybe at the end of the administration, somewhat flagging confidence in the
Right, I was also
administration.
wondering how much people are hearing about it as a campaign issue.
Well, that may be true too, although I'll tell you, having gone through the Japan experience, the kind of China bashing we're getting now isn't even close to the kind of Japan bashing we had in the 1980s. Doesn't mean it couldn't get worse. It has been less of an issue so far. Although Romney has said that one of his first things he would do is go after the Chinese currency, and the Obama administration has begun to stricter enforcement of trade laws than before. Although I can tell you, having covered presidents for the last 30 years, every president says he's going to enforce the trade laws more than the guy who preceded him. It's just, and they all do something to kind of better enforce the trade laws. I'm not sure it helps the trade deficit much, but it's good politics. But so you see that our views of China kind of go back and forth. But we're certainly divided on China at this moment. Excuse me, sure.
Would in fact depend a lot on what is known about China and the general populace. Because, first of all, China is one of the BRIC countries.
Yeah.
And being a BRIC country means that it has a faster growing economy than what the U.S. has. And that it is a force to be reckoned with. Now, take that and put it with the fact that 21% of the public debt of the U.S. is in the hands of China.
Yeah.
And I think what's being overlooked is how much of the U.S. does China own? Because buildings are being bought, systems are being bought, factories are being bought. Excuse me, all sorts of internal things. So that's going to put the figure further beyond this 21% that everyone is talking about.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, I think that we have to look ahead, right? Right now, Chinese foreign direct investment is actually very low in the United States. There's some examples, but it's not anything close to, say, German or Dutch or even Japanese foreign direct investment in the United States. But the projections that have been done suggest it's in the takeoff phase. And if you look at what the Japanese did in a very short period of time, we can anticipate huge amounts of foreign direct investment by the Chinese firms in the United States. And we know that, I mean, there's this question of, as you say, whether our treasury notes, whether there's a danger that our treasury notes are held by the Chinese. I guess you have to look at that 2 ways. I mean, one is, if the Chinese were to sell that money, they say we're going to get rid of those holdings, they'd have to buy something else. They're going to put it in their mattress. So, in essence, there's a certain control on how much they would actually be willing to sell in a short period of time, because they have to buy Euro bonds, which don't exist yet, or they have to buy Japanese bonds. They have to buy something else. On the other hand, and I think this is where I'm more likely to say there is a danger here, is that if there were a crisis, say, over Taiwan, and we sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Straits, as we did, to demonstrate to the Chinese government, you can't mess with Taiwan. Would the Chinese government say, yes, if we sell these bonds, these treasury notes, overnight, we're going to lose money, right? Because anything you do quickly, you tend to lose money. But we don't care, because we're going to send a message to the United States. And it would cause real turmoil on Wall Street. And so they do have some leverage, I think, in a crisis. Because economists would say, oh, it would be, you don't shoot yourself in the foot, it would be a bad economic. These wouldn't be economic decisions. They would be military decisions. These would be strategic decisions. And in those conversations, we know from history, basically the economists lose the argument, and the foreign policy types, the security types, win the argument. So, and it'd be a nationalist argument, so it had great power in China. The second issue is the coming foreign direct investment from China. It does seem to me, we know from the Japanese experience, this can lead to incredible anxiety among our people. Oh, they're buying us up, they're taking us over. And again, the fact that the Japanese ended up wasting a lot of money, they bought that famous golf course out by San Francisco, Pebble Beach, they bought Rockefeller Center. I mean, all these things, they lost money on them. Some people are going to poo-poo it and say, well, it'll come to nothing. I'm not so sure it'll play out that way. We do have to be worried that the Chinese won't just buy companies to get their technology, transfer their technology back to China, and produce the same thing in China. That's one issue. That's a fear. There's not a whole lot of examples of that yet, but it's a legitimate fear. There will be cultural problems. We've certainly experienced those with the Japanese, where they didn't know how to act as a foreign corporation in an American continent. Why should we support the Little League team? That's a crazy idea. We don't do that kind of thing in China. And that creates tension. And there's always the issue that the Chinese, let's face it, when I say it's the Chinese, they launch, but China's the only country in the world in which we have a war with the world. We weren't about to go to war with the Japanese. And even then, we had problems of not wanting to sell them certain technologies, militarily related technologies. There's a whole range of things we want the Chinese to buy, especially in Silicon Valley. So it's going to be a tension-filled buying spree by the Chinese, because we're going to say, no, you can't buy this and you can't buy that. What we do know from public opinion surveys is that while the American people still worry about foreign direct investment, they worry less now than they did in the 1980s. In part because I think the public has just become more accustomed to this. It's okay that I work for a foreign manufacturer. It's not the end of the world. It's not culturally kind of odd to me to work there. And it does seem to me that we have to acknowledge to ourselves we need job-creating investment. And if the Chinese have the deepest pockets in the world at this point, and if they're going to come to our town and create 200 jobs, it's a little hard to say no to that, especially if you're the mayor or the governor. And so there's going to be a lot of kind of tension and a lot of value created here as well, and so that's one of the issues. One of the things, though, about the rise of China is that the perception of the U.S. around the world, this is outside the United States, of who is the world's leading economic power has changed. Now, this is for surveys we've done between 2008 and 2012 in 14 countries. And as you can see, basically there's a growing sense that China is the world's leading economic power and that we are no longer the world's leading economic power. Now, factually speaking, this is wrong. We are still the world's leading economy. We are the largest economy. We are the most innovative and creative economy. We are the richest people by far. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Almost on every indicator, we're still the world's leading economy. However, that's not the perception of the public around the world. And, that creates political problems for the United States. Yeah.
Do you have to remember what the 14 countries are?
No, but I can get you the list. I mean, it's 4 or 5 European countries, Japan, number of countries in the Middle East, number of countries in Latin America. So, yeah.
Is that based on perception that if you go to a place like Walmart, Kmart stores, how much do you see made in the United States?
Yeah.
But as compared to
I'm sure
China,
part of that is people see these products, these Chinese-made products all around them. Look, they read stories in newspapers about the Chinese behemoth and about the Chinese dynamo, etc. It's a rich country, right? It's the fastest-growing country in the world. All these things, and people are, I think, aware that the amount of change in China in our lifetime is phenomenal. It's just incredible. So it's a combination of all those factors. And but you raise an interesting question. It is, as you work with public opinion data, and I can say this because I don't have a PhD in public opinion, I'm a recovering journalist, is that it's an art, not a science. You don't know why people have certain feelings. Now, it is true, though, that they probably don't know either. You're asking them their impression. Who's the biggest economy, strongest economy in the world? And what went into making that impression is a variety of different, TV show I saw last night. The fact I went to Walmart and everything was from China. It said, my brother went to China and said Shanghai is an amazing place. I mean, all these kind of things go into forming that opinion.
Well, two things. In the world of investment, isn't perception a reality? That's the one thing. And the other one is that. Actually, I'll leave it at that. I'm just going to focus on that. What do you think of the idea that how people perceive China determines the investments that are made?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you the number of businessmen who've told me, look, my board of directors says we have to be in China, right? And this is the collective wisdom of guys who read, the Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times, and Business Week, and all these other things, and they talk to their buddies on the golf course, and they all say, I got to be there, right? And that could change, right? I mean, India could be the next hot place, or I actually talked to the guy who's now retired, but he was the head of the American Electronics Association, and I said to him, when you talk to your CEOs in Silicon Valley, where are they going to be producing this stuff in 20 years? He said, Africa. And I said, are you nuts? I mean, there's no infrastructure, there's no education. He said, yeah, you're describing China 20 years ago. And so it is a lot of it's a perception. And if those guys really believe this, they will then make it happen because, they'll encourage governments to do what needs to be done to get the investment conditions right, etc.
So the other thing, the other corollary was the fact that the perception is there, then the activity will be there, which is what you said. It creates sort of a vortex of activity that everybody's drawn to.
Yeah.
Because that's where all the attention goes.
Sure. And it's one of the challenges that the administration faces, for example. The administration is trying to say, look, we need a revival of manufacturing in the United States. And it's one of the challenges they face. Now, that may be factually correct or incorrect. But let's assume it's factually correct. I happen to believe it's correct. But, I mean, there's a debate about that. Okay? Let's assume it's factually correct. You still have a perception problem that people say, oh, manufacturing, that's old, that's yesterday, the future is X, services, or it's high tech, I don't know what, whatever people say. And it's difficult to flip that perception and to say, oh no, we can do this, and in fact it's good for the country, and that's that's why politicians should get elected or unelected. If they're good at changing those narratives, then they're going to get elected.
I agree. I look at the dates here, 2008, when China got the Olympics.
Yeah.
That did, you look 4 years later, they introduced the new China to the world.
Oh, yeah.
And they spent, and I don't think we can underestimate, and I think Brazil would do that in a few. Brazil,
It's one of their goals. Anyway.
that's their goal, to reintroduce and to build their economy and to say, look at us, what we can do, thereby moving and changing.
Supposedly, this was one of the motivations for the Japanese to have the Tokyo Olympics in 1960. That, we are revived from World War II, we're a new Japan, we're a dynamic Japan, and Japan scholars believe that in fact had the exact effect. Obviously, you know as well as I do that there's an ongoing debate in the United States about whether trade is good for us or not. Economists tell us it's good for us, and a lot of people have some doubts about whether trade is good for us. We'll leave aside for the moment whether it's inevitable, but because my personal view is whether it's good or bad for us, at some level, it's the future, and we kind of have to adapt to it, but that's a personal view. What we see here is a slight decline in American attitudes towards trade. People saying about half the public says it's good for us. We've gone from about a third say it's bad for us to about 2 out of 5 say it's bad for us. So it's the opposition is growing, but it's what? Oh, I'm sorry. What is interesting is when you ask people, well, if we were to increase trade, who would you like to increase trade with? And here you get a good sense of like who people think are quote unquote fair traders, and who they think are maybe not such fair traders, and how these things can change. As you can see, nobody has any problems with trading with Canada. It's the 51st state, they're a member of NAFTA. Unless you get into very narrow little subgroups of people whose plant has been affected by something, everybody thinks. What's amazing is that people feel fine about trading with Japan today. I swear to you, in the 1980s, that number would not have been 60%. They were perceived as unfair traders. For whatever reason, they're not being perceived as a threat, or they're not perceived as
wasn't that because they stole our electronics and our steel industries from us?
Well, that's a separate question, and we can debate that. I think you're absolutely right about that. But I mean, and it may be, to go to your point, that you just see a lot of products on the market from Japan, and the Toyota you drive has a good repair record, and you kind of like Japanese products, and so let's do more trade with Japan. Whether some of that ability, say, in the auto industry for Japan to build up that quality and build up that kind of potential in the market is due to the fact that the Japanese auto market is the most closed auto market in the world. They can sell us, last year, if I have my numbers correctly, they shipped to us 600,000 cars. We shipped 6,000 to them, or 60,000 to them. So, I mean, the differences are enormous, right? And so it goes to your point. But the public doesn't know that. I mean, this is a perception issue. Whereas the Chinese, and amazingly interesting, the South Koreans are not necessarily people who want to improve trade with. We just approved a free trade agreement with Korea. So that's kind of went against the public perception. We asked people to give us a sense of what they thought the impact of trade was on their lives by a variety of measures. And what we found was that basically people believe by 55 to 8 that it destroys jobs, it doesn't create jobs. So this is pretty overwhelming. Nobody believes that trade creates jobs, which of course is something that economists tell us all the time, right? And as you can see, it's a bipartisan belief. It's not that the Democrats believe it destroys jobs and the Republicans believe it creates jobs. Nobody, the president says it creates jobs. Romney says it creates jobs, but the people, the public, don't believe it. They also very strongly believe that trade undermines wages. I think there's stronger economic evidence here to support that. The broadest economic theory, if you introduce 500 million new laborers to the global market, as you had with the introduction of China and with India into the global market in the last generation, for those of you who studied any economics, you increase the supply, you reduce the price. So it is one of the consequences of globalization that people get, they understand. Basically, people believe trade slows the economy, doesn't grow the economy. Again, that's economically debatable, but people pretty overwhelming by 2-to-1 basically believe it slows the economy. I find this middle set of data the most interesting. I mean, there's one thing I think that has generally been conventional wisdom, and certainly is the conventional wisdom among economists, is that trade does lower prices, right? It allows you to buy T-shirts from China that would cost more to be made in the United States. American people aren't sure they believe it. They don't disbelieve it, but they're really divided on it. And I can tell you, when you present this data to business leaders and so forth, this is very disheartening, because this is the one thing they assumed everybody agreed on, that trade lowers prices. The public doesn't buy that. And people do believe it's good for people in developing economies. I don't think that's a good number, right? I mean, because it's not that, oh, this is great, we're helping these poor benighted Chinese. It's helping them and not us. So I do think that this is a fairly negative assessment of the impact of trade, at least in the body politic and the public's. If you look at the breakdowns by party, as you can see, they are pretty overwhelming in terms of both parties doing that. Now, yeah.
I think what was interesting was the number of independents was so high in some of these who don't consider themselves a member of either of the quote major parties, but the independents. I mean, 49, 60.
What we don't know, and again, you'd have to have larger surveys where you could break these numbers down a little bit better. Is that a sign of the Tea Party movement, right? And those people who on other issues are Tea Party members. What we found here in the Congress is that Tea Party members of Congress tend to actually be pro-free trade. The question is whether they reflected the views of their constituents, the people who are base that actually got them elected. And there haven't been that many controversial trade votes in the Congress to be able to sort that out. But it is an interesting question to raise, because given the kind of more nationalistic, isolationist views of some of the Tea Party, self-described Tea Party members in response to other questions, you would think they'd be more protectionist too, but we just don't know that. One of the issues that comes out of the globalization of the U.S. economy that was a positive one, and that is that we are interacting with the rest of the world, and this may in fact be helping us in terms of the world's perception of us. Clearly, the single most important thing that happened in terms of improving the perception of the United States abroad, which, by the way, may or may not be important, right? I mean, obviously everybody likes to be liked, and I think the anti-Americanism in the world during the Bush years was a drag on the United States. It's not at all clear how important that was. I mean, to be honest, some academic studies were done that showed that despite the huge amount of anti-Americanism in Europe in the first part part of this decade. The sales of American products didn't suffer. There was no kind of cost to this that was paid by the American economy. That said and done, the single most important thing that probably helped America's image was the election of Barack Obama. We came out with a survey 2 weeks ago that showed that while Obama's popularity and America's popularity had slipped a little bit, we're still talking about 87% popularity in France. I mean, any politician would die for that kind of popularity, right? And he is far more popular abroad than he is at home. And that if you feel good about Obama, you are much more likely to feel good about the United States. So the best thing that's done for brand America is the election of Obama. That doesn't mean we should re-elect him, but the point is we should anticipate if we don't re-elect him that the image of the United States may suffer a bit. What the globalization has done is, it seems to me, it has enhanced brand America around the world. As you can see, basically, people overwhelmingly admire U.S. technological and scientific advances around the world. We're identified with that in people's minds. Very positive for us. People like American music and television, and I can tell you we can break this down by age. It's especially young people who like American television and movies. Then you get into some of the more problematic stuff. American ideas about democracy, people are more or less split. They have increased their appreciation for American ideas about democracy. We don't know whether that has to do with electing Obama and unelecting Bush. I guess that was some of it. And we also don't know what people hear when we say ideas about democracy. It could be, I dislike the way you finance your campaigns to, I still remember that Florida vote count. You don't know what people are thinking. But what's interesting is the trend. But it's still less than half of the public around the world thinks well of U.S. ideas about democracy. So we have some selling to do about our democracy. Again, people's appreciation of the way we do business has gone up, which is positive from an American business point of view, but still less than half the public is supportive of that. And again, we don't know what that means. We don't know whether was Lehman Brothers a black eye for the United States or not. Is it Wall Street that people are afraid of or not? We just don't. We don't know. What is clear, though, is, and this last question is our Americanization question. Generally, ideas and customs spreading, people like that. And while it's gone up a bit, people are okay with that. It's still only about 1 in 4 people around the world are okay with Americanization. So I think this is a reminder that there's a limitation here of the influence of our culture through globalization. That people still distrust it, or they at least want their own culture. And I can tell you, we do another question that I think is the most telling anti-globalization question that we do. We ask people periodically, do they think their traditional way of life is changing, and do they like that or not? And basically, people everywhere, including the United States, say that they believe that their traditional way of life is changing too fast. And I think that I can tell you, we've done a series of questions all over the world about globalization itself. This is not just in the United States, but everywhere. What do you think about trade? What do you think about investment? What do you think about cultural products, etc., from other countries? Everybody loves that. The idea that there's this widespread opposition to globalization, I think there's no way to prove that in the data. There's an occasional demonstration, and it's violent, but for the most part, people like globalization. What they don't like is the rapid pace of change in their traditional way of life. Again, we don't know what traditional way of life means to people. Every person's going to be slightly different. It might be, his family life is changing, his work life is changing, his religious life is, whatever it is. But we do know that globalization is change on steroids, right? If the market economy in creative destruction is the strength of the market economy, globalization just amps that up because you have more change and it's more rapid pace and it's coming from all sorts of directions. And it's clear that people feel very uneasy about that. So, including in the United States. So it does lead you to think about what are the policy responses to that. What could we or could we not do to help people through that transition? Just to briefly, though, look at this, as you can see, people like American pop culture, and it's going up, basically, and they don't like it in the Muslim world. So you can see that we still have some selling to do there, except in Lebanon. They tend to like American pop culture in Lebanon, but that's about it. As I said, young people embrace U.S. pop culture much more than older people. That's to be expected. It gets back to what they spend their time doing, and they're on the internet more and so forth and so on. And that's even the case in the Muslim world. Much more, you can see there's huge differences between young people in the Muslim world and older people in turn. And so that's actually, it seems to be a good sign in the sense that assuming people's cultural tastes kind of stay with them for the rest of their lives, which may or may not be the right assumption, but assuming that, you're winning the hearts and minds of younger people. Now you're winning it with American hip-hop music and movies. I don't know if that's enough of a victory for U.S. culture. Again, people are very supportive and admiring of U.S. technological products. But you can see in this, for example, I mean, basically people overwhelmingly like our scientific and technology products. But there was a hit that this took during the anti-Americanism phase of the last decade, because it declined a bit, and what else would explain that except that it had American attached to it, and so people feel that kind of alienated some people. Still, overwhelmingly, people supported it even in the middle of the Bush years, but it's picked up again. And as you can see, it's picked up even in Muslim countries, and it's still very strong in China. American ways of doing business up dramatically in a number of countries, but still below 50%. And that's it. And you guys haven't asked enough questions. But certainly, if there's anything more we can talk about, I'm happy to. Yeah, sure.
What is the basis when you do your surveys?
Yes.
Not the international, but national.
Sure.
Are you taking a combination or compilation from different parts of the country? You know what I mean?
Yeah, you do it all over the country, and it's generally 1,000 people. In the United States, it's by telephone, and these are kind of randomly chosen. But then with your demographics, you kind of balance it out. So at some point, you have enough people over 50, and you have to get more people between 29 and 50, and you balance that out. And it's done over multiple days, 3 or 4 days, and it's a random sampling across the country. And it's both cell phones and regular phones, landlines, because as you know, so many young people, especially, don't have landlines, and you'd miss all those people if you didn't.
Does anybody say you have more of a Democratic or Republican, certain surveys?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think we're generally seen as nonpartisan. I mean, we certainly try to be nonpartisan, and I think our surveys are generally viewed as not affiliated with either liberals or conservatives. Now, if people don't like the results of the survey, there's, it's a liberal survey, it's a conservative survey. But as opposed to a lot of surveys that are done by firms that actually do work for Democrats or do work for Republicans, we don't do any political work. Yeah.
I have a question that you may not be able to address because you're not in the education department, but here we are. I am one of the many educators here. And I'm interested in your comment about how manufacturing should return to the United States. But I, as an educator, am facing a conundrum that is well, that's all very nice, but who's going to work there? Because we have been on a path to project to all our children that our children are like in Minnesota, above average, and that they will all go to college, and vocational schools don't exist, or have over time been eliminated or have a bad name. And so who exactly is going to work there when everybody thinks they're going to college? And then now colleges indeed have in fact...
I agree. I did a piece for Atlantic Magazine about 2 years ago on this, and I went back to actually my hometown, where the steel mill has survived, right? Miraculously. Has only 1,500 workers, not 4,500 workers, but it's more productive, produces more than it ever did. And I went to the vocational high school that's attached to the high school I went to. And so this was a town where you could still get a job in manufacturing. And a good paying job that a welder with overtime could make like $60,000 a year. And they had trouble, sorry, I gotta turn this phone off. They had trouble finding people to fill the manufacturing jobs that were available in that town. And there were more kids enrolled in the beautician's class in vocational education than in manufacturing classes. And I talked to the, and I'm sure you experienced the same thing in your high schools. Kids don't want to go into manufacturing because their grandfather lost his job in manufacturing or his father lost his job in manufacturing. This idea that you come home and you're all dirty and you're grime and grit under your fingernails and so forth, when in fact modern manufacturing jobs are you're sitting watching dials. I mean, you do have to have more training and capacity than our grandfathers did in those manufacturing. You basically have to have algebra and you got to be able to compute numbers. So that's a bit intimidating, I think, for some people. But I think it's a real problem, and I think that's why, even before you kind of figure out how we're going to do this, we have to figure out a way to change the conversation in the country where it's acceptable to not go to college. I mean, Rick Santorum got crucified for saying that not everybody had to go to college. He's actually from my hometown, by the way. But there was, I think, an element of truth to that. We have to have a frank conversation about what's the appropriate education for people, and assuming there are jobs there. You shouldn't push people in a direction where there aren't going to be jobs, but where there will be jobs or there are jobs. And then, but before that, you almost have to kind of change the conversation nationally, so people say, "Oh, that's a good future for me." We're a long way from that, I think. I mean, in Germany, for example, you have that. I mean, basically, that's an honorable profession to pursue. Now, it creates its own problems, as I'm sure you as educators will know. The Germans, track kids. And so in junior high school, you're on a college track or you're on a professional, skills track. And, I remember when I was growing up and I heard about that, I thought, well, is that a little bit early to kind of decide for a kid when, I don't know, he's 13 or 14, that he's not college material and he's got to go off and, learn to be a machinist. I don't know. At the time, I thought it was unfair. In retrospect, I'm looking back and thinking, well, that's a problem, but maybe we need to do more of that. Yeah.
Well, all the countries you mentioned have tracking in Europe and China and Japan and so on. People are tracked early, and now, shouldn't this country look at how other people do it and try to be more successful? Because what happens in our classrooms is we teach for the middle. So we're not encouraging, let's say, if there were tracking, there would be maybe the college tracking, where we develop thinkers for the 22nd century, and then the vocational tracking, where you develop workers for the 22nd century, which includes algebra and calculus or whatever is necessary too. But it's a different type of participating in the economy, and I just see that I think that the thinking behind how to educate the American kids is far behind what the needs are of the economy. Because if you want to put the kids to work, well, first of all, you don't have kids who want to work or who are capable of working in any manufacturing. And so you have to send the jobs overseas because you have nobody to do them here.
I think this is one of our central challenges going ahead, and it's fraught with political, as you can imagine, at the local level. What do you mean my kid isn't college material, kind of stuff. But I do think we as a nation have to kind of, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it may not even be the kids, the parents, that are going to give the most resistance. My kid is going to college. He's not going to be a plumber. He's not,
the fact that he can make more money as a plumber than he does as a lawyer.
Right. I was just going to say, their kid's not going to be a plumber. When a plumber is going to make more than a teacher will.
Yes.
And you're going to get more resistance from the parents than you will from anybody else.
I agree. And somehow it's got to be deemed acceptable, and that's going to take a lot of kind of national conversation. Yeah.
You said you were a recovering journalist.
Yeah.
The issue of the journalism in America, how it's changed, how it's been bought up by the corporations, and how it's influenced everything. How do you see that affecting the attitudes of the polls that you guys are taking?
The positive story is that there are far more sources of information now for the public than ever before. I mean, certainly when I was growing up, there were 3 network newscasts. They most all said the same thing. You didn't have to watch 3 of them, watch 1 of them. The value of that was that there was a single national conversation going on. The downside was, arguably, you didn't have a free market of ideas, right? Today, what we know from surveys is that people go to a source of information that reinforces what they already believe. So you don't have a national conversation about ideas or what's happened, what's happened in the world today, right? And, liberals go to MSNBC and conservatives go to Fox, or people go to even websites which have no editorial control whatsoever, right? And so they kind of absorb all this information that nobody's checked to see if it's factually accurate. Just reinforces a point of view. I think that's very dangerous for a democracy, very dangerous. And I would much rather go back to 3 networks than go down the road we're pursuing. We can't. I mean, the genie's out of the box, it seems to me. I think the real problem with news in America is that, when Edward R. Murrow went to the president of CBS back in the 1940s, and he said to him, I'm worried that you're losing money on the news operation, and are you going to be able to sustain this over time? And the president of CBS News said, you worry about the news, I'll worry about the money. And CBS saw the news as a loss leader, right? Now, the regulatory environment was different then. To be allowed to broadcast over the airwaves, there were rules that said you have to have so much public affairs content, etc., and we don't care if you lose money on it. That's the price you pay for using the public's airwaves. That, as part of the mass deregulation in the 1970s and 80s, we got rid of those regulations. And all of a sudden, news operations became a profit center for these corporations, not a loss leader. And I think the biggest problem has been that news is now seen as a profit center. It's cheap television, basically. And what that leads to is more and more sensationalist news. Because what you're looking for is higher numbers to watch the news, because then you can sell higher priced ads. And let's face it, the sex scandal at Penn State is more tittillating than worrying about the euro crisis. And when that was a hot issue, there were 17 times as many, there were 4 times as many people paying attention to the Penn State sex scandal as were paying attention to the euro crisis. And that, the fact that news is now a profit center, and then leads big corporations to buy these things because they can make money on them. I mean, that's I think the shift that occurred.
Well, I think the danger too is something like Solyndra. One political factor jumps on it, but doesn't say that China was making the product, those things cheaper, and they undersold it and drove an American business.
Right. I mean, the complexity of the issue gets lost, and we know from how the cable news operates that, you know, two talking heads yelling at each other would appear to draw more of an audience than some sober analysis of the complexity of a problem. And I think that we as a democracy have to worry about that, because it's not at all clear that, you know, at the end of the day, you're asking people in a democracy to make informed decisions. We all know that that's an ideal that won't be achieved totally, but if in fact the information you get is just two talking heads, and I'm firmly of the belief, and I don't have no evidence to support this, but my sense is that human beings have a finite period of time to pay attention to the rest of the world. They have lives to live, right? They aren't like me, who kind of reads 4 newspapers a day and is constantly trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, that's what I do. That's what I'm paid to do. Most people have other things they have to do. And so they have a half an hour or 20 minutes or whatever it is. And, you know, if you fill that up with sensationalist garbage from Hollywood, well, that's all the time they have. And if you know, and basically, if you look at even the evening news, you know, the major network news, after the first 10 minutes, it's all news you can use. It is all, you know, some new drug, you know, that may save somebody from dying from cancer. That's wonderful. But it doesn't tell you about the world. It doesn't kind of explain to you what's going on. Or it's some cute picture of pandas, you know, frolicking in some zoo, you know, which people love. I love it too. But it takes up that 20 minutes, some of that 20 minutes that you're actually going to have in your life to actually pay attention to the rest of the world. Yeah.
I remember years ago, like in the 90s, I lived in, excuse me for anyone from Georgia, I went from living in this region to living in Augusta, Georgia for a year, and I was amazed about the lack of interest in the world around them, and it scared me to death. You know, where my paper had once been the Washington Post, I now had the Augusta Chronicle, where the world news was in the inside of the back of the front page. The world was at the top, and the United States was at the bottom, and that was it. And I talk to my students about that. I extrapolate that about, you know, what does that mean in the world when there are segments of our society who don't know, don't care, and make huge decisions without a knowledge base. And, you know, and I says, I lived out of the country 2 years. 1 year I was in Germany, 1 year I was in Georgia, because it made me, made me feel, and people would say, well, I'm from Georgia. But it truly was, it was very sobering in that. And a second point to you, when I was in college, I spent a summer with my brother in Michigan, in Lansing, which used to be a heart of the building of General Motors.
Yeah.
And the college students I met back then graduated from college and went to work for General Motors in the factories because they made more money than they went anyplace else. So you had to, I'm going like, why are you going to college? Well, my mother said I had to do that, but when I compared the salaries, working in the steel mill, overtime, this, that, and the other, they were perfectly happy. And I found it to be like, oh my God, you're going to go work in a factory.
Sure.
But this was the mentality. And my third question is this. The Obama administration in rebuilding the manufacturing industry of the automobile, does it not prove that we as a nation can still make things? Because we went from building things and having everything made for us, and then that versus now we've proven that in Ohio you can make this to put this car together. We can become a factory-based economy in some respects, maybe not the way we once were, but that's a true.
I mean, I firmly, just to go to your last one, I mean, I firmly believe we can. Yeah, it will never absorb the percentage of our working population as it did, say, in the 1940s when it was at its peak, right? There was no competition then, right? I mean, Europe and Japan were flat on their back. China wasn't a player. It's never going to go back to that. And there's a more profound challenge, which is you can make things now with far fewer human beings. I mean, I go into the steel mill in my hometown, and when I went there in high school, it was this beehive of activity, this anthill of people running around. And now there's a couple of guys sitting up looking at computer screens in some little booth, and everything's done automatically. And that's just the way of the world. That's called productivity. That's good for the economy. You're not going to turn that back. But the question is whether you can just get that employment, because the value of manufacturing employment, which you haven't been able to get around, is that it creates more value added than most service jobs. And if you create more value added, you can pay people better and provide them with greater benefits. And at the end of the day, this is a personal view. The challenge that faces America is that the median income in this country really hasn't changed much since I graduated from college. And in fact, among white males, like me, 28% decline in median income for all white males since 1970. No wonder people are upset. No wonder people are angry. No wonder people feel like they've been robbed of the American dream. Because they have been, right? I'm not blaming anybody for that. It just happened. But the point being that if you end up in inflation-adjusted dollars making 28% less than you did in 1970, your standard of living has gone down. Full stop. And you have not, and now you're reaching retirement age. And I think that's an issue we have to address. And part of addressing it is you need more manufacturing jobs because that creates more leaven in the economy. Yeah, but do you? No, here. I'm sorry. Yeah.
In 1986, teachers in New York State went to conferences where corporation people addressed us and told us that we needed to change the way we were going to teach because all of the manufacturing jobs were going to be outsourced. And we sat there, every single one of us, knowing that IEP profiles were going up and that disabilities were being better identified, looked at each other and said, well, what about the other kids? My question is this. The American dream didn't just happen, that it was taken, that it disappeared. The American dream was stolen. It was stolen through the greed of corporations. And at what point will someone in politics have the cojones to say to these people, you need to talk to the educators before you make decisions. You need to find out what the population can handle before you make these decisions. Am I being naive?
No, look, I think that, to your first point, I won't get into the politics of it. I have my own personal politics, but I won't get into them. But that's class warfare. We don't do class warfare in the United States. I hope you get the facetiousness in my voice, right? Right, exactly. Right. But I think you're right. I think that there was an assumption made that services were the future, manufacturing was the past. That was look, people could perceive what was happening and say, let's get there first. That's understandable. But it was also, there was a self-interest of some people pushing that line, right? And you're right. And I never once, and you raised a very interesting point, I never once in those debates ever heard anybody raise the point you just raised, which is to say, have you really ever talked to anybody who's in the classroom and whether they think all of their kids are qualified to do service jobs? I mean, and especially, remember, when the discussion was first broached about service jobs, we were all going to be computer engineers, right? It wasn't we were going to flip hamburgers. We're going to be a much richer economy because we're all going to do these really high value-added service jobs. In fact, the data show that, in fact, that hasn't happened. And there was a cultural implicit and cultural superiority implicit assumption there, which is only we can do these, computer programming jobs. Those Chinese are too stupid, or those, Mexicans are too stupid. And the reality is there are millions of those people outside the United States who can be trained to do those kind of jobs. And they all aspire to them too. And that's one of the things that we've failed to talk about in making the assumptions about the future of the economy, that why in the world would the Chinese want to be the haulers of wood and the hewers of wood and the haulers of water for the rest of the world forever? No, they want to build, jumbo jets. They want to design and build semiconductors, and they're doing it. And I think that's one of the challenges we'd never fully kind of understood as we went into this new era in our economy. I got to go because I'm already late for my next appointment. But thank you so much.